Hi, it's Jim Holt here in New York. I'm a writer for the New York Times Magazine and for the New Yorker. And I write a lot about philosophical and cosmological issues. And because of this, I often butt up against the work of a very interesting Canadian philosopher of physics, among other things, whose name is John Leslie, with whom I'm speaking. And John is perhaps the world's foremost authority on a question that I consider to be the most awesome of all in philosophy, the question, why does the world exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? John, why don't you tell us about yourself and we'll get going.
Well, I'd like to say at the start, I doubt whether there's any such thing as an authority on why the world exists. I don't think anybody knows, and I'm an authority maybe on the range of the guesses which have been given, and I have my own ideas in this field. I'm a retired professor of philosophy. I have concentrated a lot on philosophy of religion and also philosophy of cosmology. And as Jim said, I've spent a lot of time on this question of why the world exists, and in fact I first came across Jim through a very interesting article he wrote for Harper's Magazine about a dozen years ago with the title Nothing Ventured, a Bold Leap, and the leap was into the question of why there's a world and not a blank. Would you like to say something about that, Jim?
Yes, well, actually, what I wanted to begin with, if this is all right with you, is the question of immortality. Recently, I wrote a piece in the New York Times Magazine. It was prompted by the spate of books by the, I guess they're called neo-atheists, people like Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins and so forth, all of whom argue that God does not exist and it's time for Western civilization to dispense with the God hypothesis. And the interesting thing about that, it struck me, is where does that leave the idea of immortality? Can one believe in immortality, in an afterlife, if one doesn't believe in God? And most people think, no, once you give up religious faith, you also give up the idea of an afterlife. But you, John, believe that there's a possibility of immortality, indeed more than one possibility, even if there is no God. And that's, to me, that's the question of the theme of burning interest at the moment. So tell us about that.
Well, I think there's more than one. I think there's three ways you could have immortality, even if there's no God. One of the ways is the afterlife, which most people think about, and there you probably have to have something like a God. But it needn't be the God that most people imagine, a divine person. The other two ways, you don't need to have anything like religious belief. You can just get them direct from modern science. And it was one of those ways which Jim took up in this New York Times Magazine article. That was the business of a single unified thing, living the lives of everybody and continuing to live other lives when your life has ended. That's the thing which attracted your interest in particular, Jim, didn't it?
Yes, but tell us what this single unified thing. I mean, one idea of immortality is that even when I die, when my biological existence comes to an end, when I existed, I was part of a larger entity, and that entity will continue to exist. Now, what do you mean by that? And what does science tell us about this entity? What sort of entity are we talking about?
Well, the entity in question is the universe, and modern quantum physics seems to tell us that all the parts of the universe are simply abstractions. They don't exist in isolation. Think of a brick. A brick has got length, it's got width, but the length and the width, they don't exist separately, and neither does the color of the brick exist separately. Suppose the brick is red, well, it's the redness of the brick which exists, not the redness by itself. And quantum physicists have found that whenever two particles interact, they, from then onwards, seem to share their properties. They have a shared existence. And what comes out of this is the idea that there's a single thing, the universe. All of its parts are just abstractions from it. They don't exist separately. and that thing is living your life, it's living my life, and when we're dead, that thing will be living other lives. And we could be glad about this. We could think that even if our personalities don't go on after our deaths, the thing which has been living our lives will go on after our deaths. And that would be something to look forward to.
Well, John, when I walk out of my apartment building tomorrow morning and in my half-asleep state get hit by a bus, and that's the end of me. Now, this entity that I'm a part of, the universe, the quantum universe that I'm entangled with, will go on, and all of my information will continue to exist. But that's not the kind of immortality I want. I want the kind of immortality that comes from not dying, or from my consciousness not expiring. And is there any hope there? If there is no God, then what chance is there that even after my brain is destroyed, that my consciousness, that my self could somehow continue to exist? Can you hold out any hope for us there?
Okay, well, let me just say that the fact that you don't care about the continued existence of a thing which doesn't carry your personality, that doesn't mean to say that everybody's going to go along with you. A large number of people in the Far East think that the important thing is being an aspect of the life of Brahman, and the life of Brahman will continue on after they have died and their personalities have been destroyed, and they will benefit from it. They won't benefit as personalities, but still they'll have something which might be worth calling personal immortality. They will get benefits through having, as they think of it, gone into the heart of a cosmic whole, faded into the heart of a cosmic whole. So it may just be a Western prejudice, not shared by a large number of Hindus, which leads you, Jim, to hope that you personally, your characteristics won't be wiped out. But if you are worried about your characteristics being wiped out, well, there's two ways in which I could comfort you. And the first way is that if you accept the Einsteinian view of the universe, then none of your life will ever have been wiped out, because your life is a whole which is eternally there. We have a four-dimensional universe, and all its parts are there together, and none of them will ever have been wiped out. And this was a view which Einstein found very comforting, and in fact he used it for comforting the relatives of his dead friend Michele Besso. He said that Besso had not been wiped out by the fact that Besso had died.
So the idea
Does that make any sense to you?
Would the idea be that it doesn't matter to me particularly that I don't exist everywhere in space? My existence is confined to, pretty much to the island of Manhattan, actually. I rarely get to leave New York. And are you saying that to want to exist forever is practically as silly as wanting to be everywhere? I mean, would something like that, does that analogy work?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I want to say that there might be something good about existing forever in the sense of going on after your death. That could be very attractive. But even if we didn't have that, there's the fact that when people rightly call you dead, you are still back there along the fourth dimension. You are not wiped out. You are in existence back there, but you're not in existence, as they would say, now. But the word now is rather like the words in New York, or in my case, I'm in Victoria, so I'm talking about here as in Victoria. For you, here is in New York. For the people of the future, when I'm dead, I won't be there then, but I'll be there earlier. And on the Einsteinian view, my being there earlier will never be wiped out, because the universe is a four-dimensional block. All of its events exist together.
Well, the problem that I have with this Einsteinian four-dimensional block universe is that I'm able to stand still in space, but I can't stop flowing in time. I'm being pushed along in the direction of to the sticky end to which all humans come. And in the block universe is an attempt to abstract away from that. And whether the flow of time is an illusion or it's real, I mean real in the sense in which real in the sense that it exists in physics, it certainly is psychologically real to me. And I think because of the way our memories are structured, we only remember the past. We can't remember the future. And I suppose that the sense that we have that we're flowing along in time has to do with the asymmetry in our memories. But that's why I suppose the idea that I will always exist, it's eternally true that Jim Holt exists in 2007 in Manhattan, isn't very comforting to me, because I can't stay in 2007. The next thing I know, it'll be Christmas, and then it'll be 2008. So, how do you take account of the flow of time in this?
Okay, well, that all gets very complicated.
Well, make it simple. I'm pretty obtuse.
Yeah. Einstein does, of course, accept that in some sense time flows, because he'll be looking at his watch and seeing when he has to get to catch the train and so on. You don't get rid of the flow of time entirely in the block universe. What you get rid of is the idea that the block universe is cut into separate little slices which come into existence one after the other. And the earlier slices are annihilated, and then the new slices come into existence. That you don't have. Now, I have met a lot of people who have reacted, as I think you are, Jim, saying that because there's this psychological drive to continue onwards and have a life which extends over a large number of dates, not just in the 2000s, but into the 5000s and into the year 5 million and so on. There's this psychological drive to hope for that. You're going to get no comfort at all from the thought that when people rightly call you dead, you're still alive back there along the fourth dimension. Well, maybe I could try to persuade you that it really would be important, and instead of looking at pleasant events which you've had in your life, think of really the nastiest things that has ever happened to you. Let's suppose you've been in extreme pain at some time. I think it ought to perhaps bother you that that extreme pain is still existing back there along the fourth dimension. That's an important thing, and it would be lovely if you could have it wiped out, but according to the Einsteinian view, it can't be wiped out. You're not feeling the pain now, but you're feeling the pain back then.
This is not comforting at all.
Doesn't that worry you?
I have to suffer from all of my past pains. But listen, John, you're being too modest here. I know in your book, in Immortality Defended, which is a wonderful popularization of some very, very profound philosophical and scientific ideas, you talked about a much more interesting possibility of immortality, more speculative, granted, but more interesting to me. And I think in one figure, one image that you used, at the moment of death, the person bubbles into a new universe that's orthogonal to this universe, and the person's sort of governing laws become the governing laws of the new universe. Now, this is an image I think that was thought up by Robert Nozick, the late Harvard philosopher. But you have developed an idea of immortality, and that we're moving into deeper and conceptually more perilous territory here, and really to the core, I think, of your philosophical ideas. The idea that we seem to exist in a physical universe, but we're actually thoughts in a sort of divine mind. Am I getting at something here that that sounds familiar to you? Because this is how I read your
okay,
philosophy.
I'd certainly like to discuss this too, because I do recognize that a large number of people wouldn't be satisfied with the sorts of immortality I've discussed so far. The idea of existing eternally as part of a four-dimensional whole, and the idea of living a life which continues onwards, being lived by other people, so to speak. They won't be satisfied with this. They want to live forever in the sense which is often held out from pulpits and so on. And I think I can offer something like this, provided that there's no conflict with the modern view that the mind is based on the brain, and that the brain rots at death. And I think the way of dealing with this view is to say, well, your brain rots at death, but it could be that your thought patterns continued onwards, that they could, so to speak, be uploaded into a new situation. And in order for that to happen, you're going to have something like God running the universe. It's going to be some sort of miracle. It's not going to be the sort of miracle which will interfere with the life which has been left behind, with your family and friends who are all grieving for you. They won't be able to realize this miracle has occurred. But it could occur without disturbance to the world in which you had been living, provided that something like God is responsible for the universe. And I've been over many years developing that view. That's how you came across my work originally, is it, Jim?
Yes. And we're moving now to the great question, I believe, that you said, so I think you shed a tremendous amount of light upon, which is the question, why does the world exist at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? And this was a question that was, I think, originally posed in that form by the philosopher Leibniz back in the 17th century. And this question has been called the darkest in all of philosophy, I think, by William James. It's that some philosophers say that, when they consider the fact that there's something, that the universe exists rather than nothing at all, they're filled with awe or astonishment or in some cases anxiety, because suddenly the existence of everything seems very precarious when you think about how easily nothing at all might have existed. And there have been various views on this that philosophers have taken. Some think the question is nonsensical, or it's impossible to answer, because if you try to explain why something exists rather than nothing, whatever you use to explain the existence of the world will be part of that which has to be explained. There are other particularly physicists who think that perhaps we can give some sort of scientific explanation of why the world exists, why the Big Bang happened. Theologians believe that the existence of the world can only be explained by positing a divine creator. But you have a completely novel, I shouldn't say a completely novel take on the question, because it was foreshadowed by a very great Greek philosopher who lived about 2,500 years ago. So tell us a little bit about your answer to the question, why does the universe exist?
Okay, well, I have my pet answer, and I was very proud of it. And then to my horror and disgust, I found that Plato had got the answer about 2,500 years ago. Plato had recognized that you can't explain absolutely everything, and that's for the reason which you just gave now, Jim, that if you explain one thing, you have to bring in something else which helps explain it. So you can't explain everything. Plato thought, though, that there was a necessarily existing realm of possibilities. And I think he was right on this. Even if you got rid of the universe, it would still be possible that there would be two sets of two apples, and that there would be a truth about these apples, that if you had those two sets of two apples, there would be four apples. And there'd be the same number of apples in three sets of five apples as there would be in five sets of three apples. There'd be all sorts of mathematical truths of an if-he-then-he sort, which would continue to be there even if the universe vanished. Now, Plato looked among this set of truths, set of realities, if-he-then-he realities, and he recognized that some of the realities were realities of goodness. If you had an empty universe, it would be a fact that that empty universe was a lot better than a universe of people who were in immense misery. And this would lead to a need for the emptiness to continue, at least so that it wouldn't be replaced by this universe of misery. But there'd be also another need, which is that the emptiness would be replaced by a good universe, a universe of happiness and interest. And Plato's suggestion was that this need for a good universe is actually what is responsible for the universe existing. He thought, as I put it, that the ethical requirement that a good universe exist was itself enough to create the universe. And
so that you're saying the universe sprang into existence in answer to a need for goodness?
Say that again, please.
Are you saying that our universe somehow sprang into existence because it answered a need for goodness?
There's a need for the existence of a good world. And provided you can sell the view that this world actually is, on balance, a good world, the idea that the need for the existence of a good world can actually create it can get it off the ground. And this has persuaded a lot of people over the ages since Plato. You often get the impression that people who believe in a God simply think that this God can't be explained, that the God has been around forever, that there's no need to explain him because he's so wonderful and so on. This isn't actually so. A number of people have said that God's existence is due to the fact that God is perfect, that there's the ethical need for God to exist, and this need is itself what is responsible for the existence of God. That's a view which has quite a long history, and as I said, it was a grave disappointment to me to discover this. I'd like to have had this view all for my own.
Well, there are two, actually three, I have three misgivings about your theory. One of them is that I'm not entirely sure that on balance the world we live in is a good world. To me it hovers right around the dividing line between net good and net evil. And my second misgiving is that I'm not at all convinced that these values like goodness exist platonically, exist objectively apart from humans, that even if there were nothing at all, there would still be this abstract idea of goodness. But my main misgiving is that we never in this world see things come into existence because they answer an ethical need. If you have a child starving in the third world, there's an ethical need for a bowl of rice to save that child's life. It doesn't pop into existence. So why should the same principle somehow engender the existence of the universe?
Okay, well you've said some things there which I think conflict with others. On the one hand, you were suggesting that these ethical needs and so on, they might just be human inventions. And then at the next moment you were seeming to take it as an absolute fact that this child ought to have the bowl of rice, I think there's some sort of conflict there going on. But taking the last point first, people who accept this Platonic view that the universe exists because it ought to, they aren't going to go around saying that absolutely all ethical needs are satisfied. They're going to recognize that there are conflicts, that you can't have all ethical needs together satisfied, they'll say. And they'll point out such things as that if you're going to have a world run by laws of nature, which is in many ways very elegant and interesting and so on, you can't have bowls of rice suddenly appearing miraculously. You're going to get from them the reaction that the fact that the child hasn't got the bowl of rice may very well be a result of the misuse of human freedom, and you can't have the good of a world in which humans are free to make decisions unless you also have the possibility that people will make bad decisions. This is the general strategy which theologians have worked out for dealing with this problem of evil, the fact that not all ethical needs are satisfied.
But if the world does exist because it answers the need for goodness, why aren't we living in the best of all, or are we living in the best of all, why aren't we living in a world in which there are no unabsorbed evils, where why aren't we living in the most ethically and aesthetically perfect world that can be imagined?
Well, in my grand vision of the universe, what the cosmos, let's say everything that exists, consists of is the following. There is an infinite number of divine minds, and each divine mind knows absolutely everything worth knowing. And one of the things which is worth knowing is the structure of a universe such as ours.
Okay, now you're saying this is an implication of your idea that the reason that the world exists is basically because it's been produced by a need for goodness. It follows from that
right. I think
the world must be much more than what we actually see. It's not just the world we're living in. There are an infinite number of minds, and all thinking. Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think if you're going to take this view seriously, you can't live with the view that goodness is in some way very limited. You're going to have to say that it's infinite. And I think that one of the things you have to believe in is that we exist as part of a divine mind which knows absolutely everything worth knowing. And what it will know will be, among other things, the structure of our universe. And we're just part of the structure which it knows. But it will also know the structure of infinitely many other universes. And it would be very, very unlikely that our universe would be the very best. The best situation is the total situation with all these universes there. And among the universes, there might be ones of precisely the sort which you would like as the very best, Jim. Right. You imagine a very best universe, well, maybe it's there, but there's also our universe as well.
I've heard the analogy drawn to a museum where every painting is the Mona Lisa. Well, that's a museum where every painting is as good as possible. But wouldn't it be more interesting to have a museum where some of the paintings are by Pontormo and some are by Monet, etc., lesser paintings, and as long as you don't have any paintings that are actually so bad.
Wait a minute, Jim. In order to make this interesting, you should be disagreeing with me all the way through, and now you're agreeing with me.
I'm going to disagree with you very vehemently in a second. I'm just setting you up.
Okay. Yeah, this is my line of thought, that if you have a best situation, it can have a lot of variety in it, and it's not necessary that the universe which we find ourselves in is the very best region.
Well, here's why I find that principle a little bit disturbing. Let's have a little thought experiment. We have a multiverse that consists of two worlds. One world is the best possible world from an ethical point of view. The other world is the best possible world, except there's a suffering, innocent baby. Now, are you telling me that ensemble of two worlds, because of the variety, because one of the worlds has a suffering baby, is better than two identical perfect worlds? That seems to be an implication of what you're saying.
Well, you have to bear in mind that I would think of these two worlds as existing inside one and the same unified reality, one and the same divine mind. Now, if the worlds existing in one and the same divine mind were absolutely identical in all their characteristics, then they'd just be one world. Mm-hmm. Right. They'd be fused into one. They wouldn't be two.
I see. Okay.
That's how that element of the defence goes. You're quite right. If these were completely separately existing things, not interfering with each other, then I think they should all be absolutely identical. And that's why I have in the system which I worked out, I have an infinite number of minds, each of which knows absolutely everything worth knowing, and they're all identical.
By the way, I think I should point out here that all of this talk of a multiplicity of worlds, some possibly identical to others, may sound extremely flaky, but it's very much the way physicists are talking these days. In the latest cosmological theories of the inflationary universe, one of the implications is that the world in which we live in is repeated an infinite number of times at great distances from our own universe. So it's I think it's ironic that some of the ideas that we're talking about that seem like they came out of the minds of of people who were eating too many lotus leaves are actually ideas that come out of mathematical physics at the moment, albeit speculative ideas. And I think what's interesting about your philosophizing is that it's grounded in your sort of rigorous training in general relativity theory and quantum cosmology and so forth, and this gives you a certain license to speculate in a rather rococo way. I think you sometimes abuse that license, but it's still you've earned it.
Well, it is comforting to find all these cosmologists taking the idea of an infinitely large universe with infinite riches in it seriously. But I don't think you'd have to be a cosmologist to take this seriously. This is a very traditional view about the nature of God, that God is infinitely rich. I think what I have to contribute here is some technical defense of the idea that if you had an infinitely rich situation, it could be explained by reference to its value. Its goodness could be the creative force which had produced it. And I think if I would like to be remembered as a philosopher for any one thing, that would be the thing I'd most like to be remembered for having put a lot of years of work into defending that. I think of the cosmology and so on as a hobby,
Mm-hmm. Right.
although I've spent quite a few years on that as well.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that the other cosmologists and physicists have come up with purely scientific explanations for why our world exists. And one of the most interesting I know of is the brainchild of a physicist, I believe he's at Brandeis, named Alexander Vilenkin. And he's done a very interesting calculation in quantum cosmology. He begins with nothingness. Now, what is the state of nothingness to a physicist? Well, it's a closed space-time that has zero radius. And to me, that strikes me as a very successful attempt on the part of a physicist to come up with a concept of pure nothingness. I mean, there's no space, no time, no matter, no nothing. So he says, let's begin with a closed space-time of zero radius, nothing. And let's do a little...
That seems to be complicated in its way. You're already talking of a space-time.
I think that people say that nothingness is inconceivable, it's ineffable, it's self-contradictory, but I think that's a pretty good stab of defining a state of nothingness. Well, let me continue. So you begin with this closed space-time of zero radius, nothing. And then you do a little calculation. What is the probability that a little seed of false vacuum that is sufficient to get the inflationary process going that culminates in the Big Bang and the creation of this universe, what is the probability that such a seed would come into existence by quantum tunneling? I'm using a lot of technical terminology here that I don't understand, but please bear with me. And he does the calculation, and lo and behold, there's a positive probability that that'll happen. There's by using quantum cosmology alone, we can explain why our universe exists. Because if you begin with nothing, there's a finite probability that a little seed of false vacuum, which we know from the theory of inflation, is enough to get the whole evolution of the universe underway. That can nucleate into existence from nothingness. So what's wrong with that? I mean, here's a nice scientific, extremely speculative. I'll agree with you. I'll concede that. But it's a purely scientific explanation of why our world exists, and it doesn't have to appeal to your idea of a Platonic possibility of goodness that exists in some abstract way that we don't understand, that somehow is creatively effective in a way that I don't quite understand. What do you have? What's your criticism of this purely scientific attempt to explain why the universe exists?
Well, I think that Plato does this sort of thing better, because Plato can point to a realm of necessarily existing realities, real possibilities, and he can point to the fact that some of these possibilities are required in the way which we think of as ethical. There's a need for them. Now, what Vilenkin is providing is, as far as I can see, something which is supported simply by our experience of how the physical world runs. It runs in accordance with certain laws of quantum physics, and he thinks of these laws as applying in this more or less empty situation where you have a curved space of zero volume, if you can make any sense of that, and it obeys the laws of quantum physics, and then a universe pops out of it. Why does it obey the laws of quantum physics? That seems to me the important question.
Why does what obey those quantum laws?
Yeah, if you
Nothing is
have
obeying
a
any quantum
law...
law. What we're doing here is we have a theory that explains the events in the world that we live in pretty well, and that theory is quantum mechanics. Now let's see if we can, this theory that works so well at explaining the evolution of the universe, let's see if it's any good in explaining the creation or the coming into existence of the universe. And by golly, it is pretty good at that. So it seems to me that we can only work with, an explanation has to begin with some set of principles, and the principles that we have are the principles that explain the world around us. And if those principles can also explain how that world came into existence out of a state of something like nothingness, that's about the best explanation we can hope for scientifically.
Well, let me give you something which seems to me to trump it. The world exists at this moment. Why does it exist at this moment? Well, there's a law that things don't suddenly pop out of existence. It existed the moment before. Why did it exist the moment before? Well, there's this law that things don't suddenly pop out of existence. It existed the moment before that, and so on. It always has existed. No problem, therefore. Always has existed in accordance with the laws of physics and so on. Well, why do you need this quantum creation of a universe? If you then point to the fact that there was a Big Bang, I simply say as a large number of cosmologists, well, a Big Bang, that was just a local fluctuation. There were lots of previous situations. There were big crunches, big bangs, big crunches, big bangs, or there's an enormous universe with little big bangs occurring here and there throughout it. I don't need this idea of a universe having come into existence from a state of near nothingness as used by Vilenkin. I've got this other neater idea which isn't anything like as speculative. I could try that route, and I'd then say, well, yes, but I prefer the Platonic route. The Platonic route seems to make more sense. Does that?
Let me try
a
different way of looking at the matter on you, and you'll recognize what I'm getting at, I think. Let's look at all the different ways that reality could have been. It could have been the case that there was nothing at all, a state of nothingness. That's one possible way reality could have been. Another possible way is reality could have been the most beautiful possible world. Another possible way is the reality could have been the best possible world ethically, which is that's to some extent your view. Or reality could just be the kind of mediocre universe that I believe we find ourselves living in. So if you look at all the possible ways reality could be, and then you ask, what is it that selects the reality that is actual, that selects the real world? You're saying that the selector is a principle of goodness, a principle of ethical requiredness.
Yeah, I stress that word requiredness.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The thing is, I don't think of goodness as just a quality like redness, which is slapped on things like an extra coat of paint. I think the basic notion of something being good is that the notion that the existence of that thing is required in a particular way. And if people say, well, it's only an ethical way, and we know that ethical ways aren't able to do anything, then this tends to be your hungry child with bowl of rice objection, that we don't see bowls of rice suddenly popping into existence everywhere. But that hungry child with bowl of rice objection can be countered by saying, well, ethical requirements can conflict with one another. One can overrule another. And then the objection doesn't seem to work. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason for thinking that ethical needs couldn't create a universe. And there we have a law that goodness is effective in producing things, which would have a reason for it, which we could have some insight into. Whereas the laws of quantum physics, as they stand, they don't seem to be things into which we can have any insight. We just have to take them as brute facts.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Why not instead take the brute fact the universe has always existed? Yeah.
But it seems to me that if you look at all the different ways reality could have been, some of them, the simplest would be nothing at all. The best would be an ethically perfect world. The most beautiful would be a universe with the most harmonious and mathematically elegant physical laws. And then there would be a whole lot of fairly mediocre possibilities like this one. Now suppose that instead of this Platonic principle of goodness that selects the best possible universe, suppose there was no selector at all. Then you would expect the reality that exists to be sort of randomly chosen. You would expect it to be a fairly mediocre universe, which seems to me is pretty close to the universe that we live in. And so, what worries me about your theory that the world exists because it's ethically required, because it answers a need to goodness, is that it doesn't seem to explain. It doesn't seem to have any observational consequences about the world. I mean, you say that we're living in a sort of a reasonably good corner of a universe that is on the whole as good as possible. But I say we're living in a fairly mediocre universe, and the reason is that the reality that got selected out of all the possible realities was selected pretty much at random. And so when you select something out at random from a wide range of possibilities, you end up usually with something that's not terribly good, not terribly bad, not terribly beautiful, not terribly ugly, pretty mediocre. And that's how I would, with respect to the cosmos, that's how I would sum up our world.
Well, I'd have thought that if you just had complete randomness, choosing among all the possibilities, you'd expect something immensely messy, because there's immensely messy possibilities than orderly ones. And so I think your theory would.
So in other words, if we were living in a kind of mediocre universe by my lights, we wouldn't expect all of the regularities. We wouldn't expect physical laws to be discoverable. We wouldn't expect the future to resemble the past. That sort of thing.
Yeah, it would be just a complete mess, because there's many more ways of being a complete mess than of being nice and orderly.
Then to make a very esoteric point here, suppose that all the different realities are defined by their mathematical structures. Now, the most generic sort of mathematical structure has lots of symmetries and invariances. To get rid of symmetries, you have to introduce complicated axioms. So if we live in a mediocre universe, it's a universe described by a fairly generic set of a fairly generic mathematical structure. Fairly generic mathematical structures have lots of symmetries, and those symmetries would explain the regularities that we see in our universe. Does that sway you at all? I wouldn't think so.
Well, I'd have thought that most mathematical structures were immensely complicated and not characterized by symmetries. I mean, just think of a curve going across graph paper, nice smooth curve. Think of all the ways in which you could make that curve wriggle in fantastic directions. So many more complicated ways than simple ways. That I think would be enough to knock on the head this view that the nature of the world is chosen purely at random. Though it is interesting that one explanation which has been seriously suggested for why there's a world is, well, there's only one way in which there can be no world, and there's an infinite number of ways in which you could have a world, and the infinite number beats the one. That's been suggested by Peter van Inwagen, and I can't take it seriously, but it's very hard to know what to take seriously in this field. It's rampant speculation, and a lot of the time I just feel that maybe the universe just happens to exist, and that's it.
I actually have my own explanation for why there's something rather than nothing, and I'm going to make you listen to it, even though that's an indignity to visit upon you. Are you ready?
Is it the one you gave in that original article?
Don't steal my suspense, John. That's not fair. Okay, suppose there were nothing. Suppose there were nothing at all. Then a fortiori, there would be no laws, because a law, after all, is something.
It is the one you have in that article.
You're
still running it.
You're ruining my timing. Okay, if there were nothing, there would be no laws. If there are no laws, then everything is permitted. If everything is permitted, then nothing is forbidden. Therefore, if there were nothing, nothing would be forbidden. Therefore, nothing is self-forbidding. Therefore, there must be something. Now, that I admit that argument is based, I think, on a pun, but it's the best I've been able to do. And I think that we've probably reached the limits of understanding here. But would you like to add something?
Well, in that same article, I remember you talking about the White King in Alice in Wonderland, who refers to the fact that Alice hasn't been overtaken by the messenger. And he says to the messenger that, well, that shows that you walk faster than nobody. In other words, you're the slowest walker around, yeah? And that's, of course, just a joke. Nobody isn't a person. Now, as part of your explanation, you said that in a state of emptiness, nothing would be forbidden, and I take this to mean it is not true that anything is forbidden. But you take it to mean there's a thing called nothing, and that's forbidden.
Right.
And I think you're making the White King's mistake from
I am, but I can't be blamed for that. I was made to read Martin Heidegger at a tender age, and it's left my reasoning riddled with fallacies like that. Don, I just want to say in conclusion that I'm, even though I'm skeptical of many of your arguments and your conclusions, I think it's wonderful that a philosopher who is scientifically sophisticated as you are has managed to breathe new life into these great Platonic arguments and arguments from Spinoza. You have a variety of Spinozan pantheism, and in your books you sort of update all of this quite marvelously with new findings in cosmology and the latest work of analytical philosophers, and I think you take it in a very daring direction, and I can't always follow you all the way, but I'm always thrilled by your flights of fancy, and I have to say that a lot of to people who are listening, a lot of John's theories are more easily parodied than refuted, and that's the mark of a very powerful, rigorous philosophical mind. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you as always, and I will go back and reread Immortality Defended, and continue to butt my head against your arguments.
Well, that's very kind, Jim. It's great, too, to know that out there in the world of science journalism, there are people who occasionally read philosophers. I do feel I have had a bit of luck getting these strange ideas published, but they're not all that way out. There are maybe
that's why
10,
I must
20
say
people
that
are thinking on the same lines.
there is a significant minority, but a significant minority of extremely hard-headed philosophers who have come around to your point of view.
Or point of views which are equally crazy. We can put it like that.
But I think to end on a note of craziness is just perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Bye then.